It took a few minutes for the cheering and shouting to die down, and by the time Mrs. Dunn had enough students silent for her to be heard, the bell rang for the beginning of the day. Mrs. Dunn glared at us as Poppy, Lauren, myself and the rest of the new students rushed past her to retrieve our bags. Mrs. Dunn's plan to humiliate the new students also failed in getting us introduced to the year group, as nobody was able to connect the 6 names to the right students. However, even without people knowing my name, I had several boys and girls coming up to me as we exited the hall and saying that was really cool what you did up there, and nobody has ever stood up to the head like that. I didn't really see it as standing up to her, as we were doing what she had asked us to do by standing at the front, but the girls and boys were also saying that that was her way of scaring us into submission. Since we're new, Mrs. Dunn wanted to make sure that we quickly feared her as much as the rest of the school did. We were the first new students to actually stand in front of everybody in the hall, whereas every new student before us had been scared into hiding amongst their tutor group until the assembly ended. It was some sort of annual tradition that took place whenever a new student joined the school. The head teacher would scare them into hiding, whilst their tutor group would protect them. Since we were the first to break the tradition, we had earned ourselves a bit of celebrity status among the students, but they still only knew us as those brave kids, or for just me, stage girl. It was only my tutor group that actually knew my name, but unless I was totally ignored for the next few hours, I was most likely going to be pretty well known by the end of the day. Standing up to the Mrs. Dunn was apparently a very big thing, and we were getting a lot of attention because of it. Jenny gave us each a pat on the back and finally met Lauren, just before my sister had to rush off to her first lesson. Luckily, Jenny was teaching Poppy and I for our first lesson, so we knew if we went to class with Jenny we'd never be late. And if we were late, Jenny might just give us special treatment for being in her tutor group. With assembly finished, the hall was quickly evacuated and the cleaners had moved in to start stacking up the chairs. Mrs. Dunn had disappeared by the time Jenny, Poppy and myself had gotten out of the hall, in the middle of a thick crowd of pupils and teachers. Poppy and I walked behind Jenny as our way of cutting through the crowd, since pushing and shoving close to a teacher was thought to be punishable by death. This allowed us to use Jenny as our own snow plow, or pupil plow, to get through the masses of black uniforms without being late. It would be a technique that Poppy and I would eventually perfect over the course of the year. Once we were into the main lobby, the crowd split up and faded as the other year groups passed by, with everyone heading down different corridors. Jenny continued on and out into the open courtyard, still unknowingly acting as our own personal bulldozer, but as she turned to look at us there was a smirk on her face that made Poppy and I freeze on the spot. "Don't think I don't know what you're doing, girls," Jenny said whilst shaking her head disappointedly. "We weren't doing anything, Jenny," I lied. "Just heading to drama class," Poppy added. "And you're just going to hide behind me until we get there?" Jenny smirked. Poppy and I remained silent and nodded. "You can't hide behind the teachers all the time, girls. With your instant popularity you should be mingling with the other students and not hanging around with me." Jenny sighed. "What's so bad about hanging out with you?" I asked. "Well, I'm a teacher and you're a student. You two should be making friends with kids your own age. Now, let's get a move on before you're both late to your first class," Jenny said as she stepped between us and turned around, then placed her hands on our backs and gave both Poppy and I a gentle nudge forward. Without our bulldozer, we had to make our way through the crowds ourselves, and without Jenny in sight, I felt smaller and more vulnerable than ever, like a little girl in an adult world. My dream of going to senior school had come true, but I was never a girl in a girl's uniform in my dreams. I always imagined myself in the boyish long black trousers and old black scruffy shoes, along with the black blazer, white shirt and tie. Never had I imagined myself in the girly version of the uniform with the long white socks, black ballet flats and the black pleated skirt. It was fair to say that my dream of senior school had been overshadowed by my sudden change of gender. Whether it was a change of gender, or just a realization of what I really was, I would never really know, but as I stood in that courtyard I knew that the achievement of getting to senior school was right at the back of my mind. All I could think about at that moment was how I was going to get through the crowd, and the air flowing around my legs that was making me feel even more nervous and fragile was not helping. I would have been better off wearing the girls' black trousers instead of the skirt, but Mum had been unwavering in her quest to make me look and feel as girly as possible. The crowd was moving so slowly that to me and Poppy it looked like they weren't even moving at all, despite the fact that the bell had rung and people were supposed to be on their way to class. So at that moment my strong leadership streak, which began when I led Poppy and Lauren to the front of the hall, decided to continue when I had a sudden thought to go around the crowd instead. Forgetting that Jenny was right behind us and would have split the crowd as she walked towards it, I grabbed Poppy's hand and pulled her away towards the wall of the main building. We found a tight corridor that ran between the crowd and the wall, so I pulled Poppy's hand again until we found ourselves sneaking past girls and boys much taller than us, all talking in small groups and slowly moving to class. We didn't want to disturb any of them, so we tried to be as quiet and hidden as possible. Apart from Lucy, the older year groups always seemed to find us younger students to be pests which they either bullied or ignored, which was why it was so daunting for us to pass through a crowd of them. The gap between the wall and the crowd got smaller and smaller as Poppy and I made our way through, to the point where we were rubbing our backs against the hard brick wall. That was where I made my first mistake of the day, and thankfully only one person noticed. Poppy tugged back on my hand as we passed by several windows, having to crouch beneath one which was open. I continued sneaking past the crowd and Poppy pulled back on my hand once again with enough strength to stop me in my tracks, our backs against the wall and the crowd slowly beginning to disperse. "What?" I asked. Poppy didn't say a word, but leaned towards me with her hands outstretched and grabbed the hem of my skirt. I briefly feared she was going to pull it down to my ankles, but she just gave it a gentle tug and freed an edge which had got stuck in one of the straps on my pink Roxy backpack. Thankfully it was only Poppy that had seen my white cotton panties, since everyone else was busy with their conversations. Poppy smoothed out my skirt herself and grinned when she asked what happened to all your ladylike manners, Elle? I was never really very ladylike, Pops. I smirked back at her. No, just clumsy then, Poppy said as we snuck past the last remnants of the crowd by sliding across the bonnet of a red Audi, somehow not setting off the alarm. The sight of Jenny calmly walking along just ahead of us, and the knowledge that she was able to easily carve a pathway through the crowd made me feel even more inferior than I already did. Knowing that Jenny and everyone else in the crowd was so much more mature than Poppy and I was just another reminder of our tiny status in the school, and that the only people we didn't have to fear were the year 7s. It was also a brief glimpse into the future and an exciting prospect in store for us when we finally reached year 10 and 11, knowing that almost every student below us was as scared as Poppy and I were at that very moment. Jenny continued walking ahead of us as calm as ever, her arms crossed and her eyes scanning around, following students as they passed her. We walked slowly behind her and did our best to imitate her calm and cool movements, just as a way to try and fit in, but before we could get into any kind of rhythm we were both suddenly pushed and nudged together by a small group of girls. They were hurrying across the courtyard and were sticking together like glue, which meant Poppy and I were stuck amongst them as they grouped around us. "Hey, you're those two new girls from assembly, aren't you?" asked one of the girls. "She's Ellie and I'm Poppy," Poppy said as we were hurried along by the group of girls, none of whom we knew but they knew us. "So that other girl that you pulled out of the crowd must have been Lauren Dawson, your sister?" another girl asked. "Yeah," I said as we all walked by Jenny, who smiled and gave Poppy and I one quick and approving nod. "That was really cool what you did," one girl said, whilst another added, "You're really brave," and finally another said, "You're both really brave." They were all staring at us in fascination, making both of us feel quite uncomfortable. Poppy and I didn't really know what else to do except smile shyly and say thanks, after which the group of girls stayed silent as we re-entered the main school building and began walking down a long corridor back to the drama building. Poppy and I tried our best to stay apart from the group of girls as we walked, but they continued walking behind us closely and were still watching us whenever I turned to look at them. At the end of the corridor we reached a crossroads where we could exit the school by going right or enter the quad by going left. The quad was a large square shape in the center of the main school building, with a closed-off garden inside it and English classrooms running along the edges outside of it. But today, Poppy and I were going straight on towards the drama classes. That was until a small hand wrapped itself around my elbow and pulled me back, and I found myself standing in the center of the crossroads with the group of girls surrounding me. 2 girls from my tutor group, Courtney and Ashley, were standing in front of us, whilst a brown-haired girl a little shorter than me kept her hand around my elbow before eventually linking her arm with mine and locking me in with the girls. Poppy stood beside me and decided to link arms with me too, leaving me stuck between them with nowhere to go. "So I see you've all met Ellie and Poppy," Courtney said with a grin, her long golden hair gently swaying as students walked past in many different directions. "What? You already know them?" asked the brown-haired girl whose arm was linked with mine, who sounded quite surprised. "Well, yeah, they're in our tutor group," Ashley said proudly. "No wonder, your tutor group always gets the pretty people," said a tall red-haired girl from the group, and I could tell she sounded a bit jealous. "Is that true?" Poppy asked. "Well, we have a couple of ugly boys with us, but we don't really talk to them anyway," Courtney said with a grin. "Do you have any idea how popular we'll all be with you two hanging with us?" A blonde-haired girl asked with her eyes focusing on me. I slowly shook my head because I couldn't think of an answer. I really had no idea how popularity in school was supposed to work. "Like, a lot," the blonde girl quickly answered her own question. "Guys, we have to get to class or we'll be late," Ashley announced loudly, and everyone turned to her and nodded, some sighing sadly as the group started to split up and head down different corridors. "So what do you guys have first?" Ashley asked. "Drama with Jenny," I said whilst Poppy nodded. "Nice. You're with us then." Courtney quickly linked her arm with mine without giving me a chance to get away, and then linked her other arm with Ashley's. Soon we were on our way again and also on our way to making our first new friends. "So I guess you're wondering how you two hanging with us is going to make us all popular?" Ashley asked. "How?" Poppy asked. "The whole year group knows all about you two after that assembly. You're like celebrities, and everyone wants to be friends with a celebrity, right?" Ashley had a sly grin forming on her lips as she spoke. "Of course," Poppy said. "Everyone will want to hang with us." "Why?" I asked, with all the popularity talk going over my head. "Ellie, even just standing near a celebrity like you will make someone feel almost as popular as you are," Courtney said with a smile. She made me think back to preparation day, at lunchtime when all those year 7s were crowding around us. It was all going exactly as Miss Darcy said it would. "Maybe not as popular as Vicky, but still really popular," Courtney sighed. "Vicky isn't popular, Court, she's just a big bully that everyone is afraid of," Ashley blurted out haughtily. "Who's Vicky?" I asked. "She's like the most popular girl in our year, and anyone who doesn't kiss up to her is against her." Courtney was eager to spew out any information. "You need friends in this school, because she'll destroy you if you're on your own and against her," Ashley said, and then grunted her displeasure. I could tell there was some bad blood between Ashley and Vicky, but listening to the descriptions of Vicky that we were getting, it was hard to imagine anyone who didn't have unfinished business with her. Ashley appeared to be the one and only rival to Vicky's domination of the year group, as everyone else either hid from her or devoted themselves to pleasing her. "So do you want to join us or Vicky?" Courtney asked. They thought that my friendship with Kirsty, the most popular girl in the year above, and our minor celebrity status would help turn the tables and lead to Vicky losing her crown as Queen of the Year group. Courtney and Ashley's master plan relied on Poppy and I joining their little clique and using our fame to increase the whole clique's notoriety in the school. The problem was that I'd be putting myself in the spotlight constantly, which I promised myself I wouldn't do. I just wanted to get through school unscathed, and that didn't seem possible if I was going to join a clique and start a war. "I don't know," I nervously said. "We'll get back to you," Poppy said with a polite smile as we exited the main school building and took a couple more steps towards the drama block. Each building located around the main school building was usually 2 floors high and very square, which led people to call them blocks. The drama block was no different, with 2 levels, a completely square shape in Jenny's classroom on the bottom. Ashley and Courtney separated from us as we blended into a large group of students gathered outside Jenny's classroom, which still appeared to be locked. "Why didn't you say yes?" Poppy asked me. "I've never been in a clique before, I just didn't know if I wanted to be at the center of a war on my first day." "Pops," I shrugged at her, not entirely sure of my answer. Poppy calling it clique was also something that was distracting me, as it made them sound not just like a group of friends, but a very girly group of friends. I was still taking the whole girlification thing slowly. All right, everyone quiet down," we heard Jenny shout as she suddenly appeared from behind us and started wading her way through the large group of students. She was fumbling with several keys as she reached the double doors to her classroom, and once she had the doors open it was the signal for every student to charge inside. There were no screams of pain as the classroom began to fill up, so we assumed Jenny had gotten out of the way of the students who were obviously quite happy to have a fun subject as the first lesson on their first day back. Jenny was already gathering files and organizing things in her little office space in the corner of the room, left of the doors that Poppy and I entered through. We were behind Ashley and Courtney and a few other students, who had a much larger level of calmness about them compared to the rest of the class. "Remember to take off your shoes and bags when you come in," Jenny shouted over the chaotic noise being made by everyone. The class was as empty as it had been on preparation day, with some tables and chairs stacked behind a black curtain at the end of the room, and nothing else on the floor except for one red chair in the center of the classroom. The class had gathered along the wall on the right side of the classroom, which was only disturbed by one small door that led into a mystery room. Everyone had taken off their shoes and bags, and left them lying against the wall, with some hanging their blazers on hooks above them. "All of you gather around that chair in the middle and we'll get started," was Jenny's first command of the lesson. With our shoes and bags removed, we gathered around the small red chair and followed everyone else as they sat on the floor. I again had to be extremely cautious of my skirt as I sat down, but even more so this time since we weren't sitting on chairs. All the other girls seemed to sit down so easily, as if the small chance of showing their underwear didn't scare them. Maybe that was the secret, to not be scared and just sit down as you usually do, but the problem was that I would normally sit cross-legged on the floor, which was of course impossible in a knee-length skirt. I watched as more and more girls and boys sat down, and quickly shot into action before I could be the last person standing. I copied another girl as she sat down and put one of my feet behind the other and knelt down as if I was curtsying. I continued to bend my knees and placed a hand on the rough carpet to support me, and then curved my legs to my side as my bottom rested on the floor. I was gladly able to sit down without incident, and made a mental note to practice sitting down like that more often, but already there were whispers of "I could see" in panties spreading among the girls and boys. The girls were particularly giggly and gossipy, but none of them were looking at me, so I relaxed and wondered who else could be as unladylike as I was. Jenny started off the class by introducing herself to those who didn't know her, but it somehow seemed pointless because Jenny must have been the most liked teacher in school, but still there were some students that didn't know her. Half of the class hadn't been taught by Jenny last year, so she had to do a good job of molding her veteran students with her new students to create a new class altogether. Any bored or blank faces were left smiling when Jenny went about correcting them, giving equal attention to everyone in the class until everyone knew her equally well. However, none of them would know her as well as the students from her own tutor group until they spent more time with her, so Poppy and I knew we would always have slightly more of a rapport with Jenny than the other students. It was of course the same with Ashley and Courtney too, but I did not yet think of us as a group of friends just yet, so for now it was still myself and Poppy going it alone. The first task was an icebreaker exercise to get everyone acquainted with each other and comfortable. Jenny handed out sheets of paper with a table of questions on them, which we had to take with us around the classroom and find the students with answers to those questions. Some were more eager than others, preferring to stand in one place and wait for people to come to them, and I was one of those who stood still, until Poppy called me a wimp, grabbed me by the arm and started pulling me across the classroom. We were still being lazy with our answers, with half of our questions answered by our own names, but for questions such as been to Paris we had to actually work to find someone who had been. We rushed all over the classroom, asking the questions on the sheet such as has a dog, plays football, reads Harry Potter, favorite color is green, and ended up getting answers for every question and learning the names of most of the class. Some of the boys turned as red as a traffic light when Poppy and I approached them, and shot out any answers we needed as soon as we asked. It was as if they wanted to run away as soon as we started talking, which left us feeling more uncomfortable and wondering what was wrong instead of feeling more relaxed as Jenny planned. Not all the boys were like that though. Some were eager to boast about what they'd done when we asked questions about sports, and they ended up talking endlessly about a competition they'd won. Then another boy would boast about something even better until either I or Poppy decided we'd had enough. There was one occasion where we didn't get answers, but rather insults when we asked one of the final questions on the sheet. Poppy and I walked up to a dark brown-haired girl with a large pointed nose, her boobs much bigger than mine and Poppy's, who had stood still throughout the exercise and leaned casually against the wall. She was waiting for everyone to come to her, and everyone so far had done so. I had kept an eye on her curiously throughout the exercise, and watched as everyone in the class at some point slowly trudged up to her with their eyes to the floor and all asked the same question. "Have you done any of these?" they all asked, and the girl snatched their piece of paper and wrote her name, at least I thought it was her name, in the empty space on the sheet. The only students I hadn't seen go up to her were Courtney and Ashley, and not knowing anyone else Ashley would ignore, I was quick to realize that this girl was probably the Vicky that everyone feared and Ashley loathed. Our early exchanges were fairly normal. She wasn't going red like some of the boys or boasting about her achievements. She was actually calm and friendly enough to make me wonder what Ashley and Courtney were on about when they said she would destroy us. Our conversation eventually reached our antics in the assembly, which had been a popular topic in other conversations that Poppy and I had had around the room with various other people. Jenny just sort of encouraged us to get up, and we did. Then everyone else seemed to get up too, I said when Vicky asked about it. Poppy and I grinned at each other and Vicky giggled along with us, but her giggles just seemed to instantly stop and her smile faded away a few moments later. Her expression turned from happy to annoyed in a matter of seconds, and was followed by her saying, "Don't do it again," in a demanding growl. "Don't do it again? What's that supposed to mean?" Poppy asked. "Look, the only reason these idiots are talking to you too is because of what you did in the assembly. You think that makes you the best around here?" Vicky leaned closer to me, her saliva spraying lightly against my face as she spoke. I felt like the confidence I had gained from my first assembly was slowly oozing out of me, and I stood there shaking. "No, we just..." I tried to say, but Vicky instantly overran me and said exactly. "No, it doesn't make you the best. If you want to be popular around here, come back when you've actually got some boobs." Vicky flicked the sheet of paper out of my hands and into my face before she turned dramatically and started walking away, only to be stopped by Ashley. "Ashley," Vicky simply acknowledged her blankly. "Victoria," Ashley did the same, but the use of her full name caused Vicky to scowl at her. My sheet of paper landed in front of my feet just as Ashley and Vicky exchanged furious glares, before Vicky continued walking. Ashley cheekily stuck a leg out and tripped Vicky, just enough for her to stumble and take a few steps before she could regain her balance. The majority of the class quietly snickered amongst themselves when Vicky wasn't looking, but when she turned back and shot lightning glares at each of them, everyone was quick to silence themselves and look away. I choked back a laugh when I almost saw the big-breasted Vicky fall on her face, and felt the confidence coming right back as Ashley grinned at me. "What were you doing talking to her?" Ashley asked. "She seemed nice at first," Poppy said. "I did warn you, she is pure evil, always," Ashley said, briefly looking over her shoulder at Vicky, who had now situated herself against the opposite wall of the classroom and was stood next to a taller but fatter girl with a constantly mean look in her eyes. "Does she think she's better than everyone because of her boobs?" I asked, feeling inferior for having smaller mounds on my chest compared Vicky. Every other girl, not that I had really been paying their chests much attention, seemed to have the same sized boobs as any other girl in the class, but Vicky's were the largest. They probably weren't fully grown, because I knew my sister Lucy had bigger boobs, as well as all the other girls in her year and the year above. But that didn't explain why Vicky had bigger boobs than anyone in the classroom, excluding Jenny. Also, I have to figure out where all this boob jealousy is suddenly coming from. She was held back a year, Ellie, and so she's a year older than any of us. She uses that to intimidate everyone and make us other girls feel really small. She's not even pretty, Poppy grunted with her arms crossed, whilst glancing across the room at Vicky. "Maybe not, but I heard she's slept with a bunch of guys already," Courtney said with a hint of jealousy in her voice as she joined us. I had no idea that girls almost as young as me were even thinking about sex, let alone doing it. "That's just a rumor." "You don't really believe it, do you, Court?" Ashley giggled lightly. "It's not that hard to believe. Have you seen how slutty her older sister is? I swear she wants people to see her panties on purpose," Courtney said hysterically. "You two aren't sluts like Vicky, are you?" Ashley turned to Poppy and I with a curious look on her face. "No way," Poppy instantly replied, whilst I shook my head and remained silent. The talk of sex was just as worrying and gut-wrenching as Mum's talk of bleeding between my legs. The four of us stood as a group on one side of the classroom, silently staring across the room at Vicky and her large friend, whose name was Natalie and acted as Vicky's evil enforcer. She was obviously the muscle of their operation, whereas Vicky must have provided the brains and pure evil. Jenny eventually came back and split the four of us up again, making sure that we never stopped collecting signatures until we had met every individual in the class. It was like a merry-go-round, going round and round in never-ending circles. This meant that I ended up meeting Ashley again, who pulled me away from the chaos and pushed my sheet of paper aside. "I've already signed yours, silly," she said with a giggle. "I forgot to tell you that I saw Natalie looking in your bag when you were talking to Vicky." I looked at Ashley in a state of disbelief, but when she looked back at me and practically said sorry with her eyes, I knew she wasn't joking. I didn't want to believe that Vicky and her sidekick had already picked a fight with me, but there was also no reason for Ashley to lie to me. I turned and spied Vicky and Natalie talking to each other, occasionally peeking at me through the crowd of busy students, so I knew something was going on. They must have watched me with huge grins on the faces as I rushed across the class to where I'd left my bag, but I found nothing suspicious aside from my bag's pathetic size compared to one of the boys' large camping rucksacks. I picked up my bag and looked closer, noticing that the two zips were left slightly open whereas I'd left them closed before. Ashley stood beside me as I dug into my bag and rifled around inside, counting each and every book, paper and pen that I remembered putting inside it. Everything that I owned, including my student ID, was in that bag, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping as I desperately searched for everything. That was exactly what I found, everything including a hard plastic card that must have been my ID, which was one thing I didn't want to lose. I breathed a sigh of relief and zipped my girly pink backpack up again, but the adrenaline rush of the incident had left me feeling totally exhausted. I realized that I'd never survive school if stuff like this was happening to me every other day, and it was obvious that Vicky had decided to target me, so I had no other choice but to move schools. Or join Ashley and her clique. "Is it too late to accept your offer?" I asked Ashley with a little grin to hide my fear. She replied with an even bigger grin and said, "Come meet the girls at break time," in the courtyard before she pulled me back towards the center of the room, where Jenny had once again summoned all the students. Courtney and Poppy joined us and we sat together in a small group, which I imagined we would probably be doing a lot more in the future if any of the clique girls were in my other classes. Vicky and Natalie were on the other side of the classroom and were surrounded by other students, who weren't even talking to them. It was preparation day all over again, as everyone was trying to sit as close to the popular people as possible, only to look as if they were part of the popular group. Vicky didn't seem to have total control over the year group, as there were some boys and girls that had seated themselves close to our little circle, listening closely to whatever we said. I did notice that a lot of the boys were trying to get close to Vicky, more so than the girls, which Courtney explained was because of Vicky's very lethal girls' football performances from last year. Ashley was more popular for her appearances in all of the school plays from last year, but Vicky had overshadowed her by winning some tournament the day before her play was shown to the public. Sitting with those girls was really the first time I'd been exposed to the world of schoolgirls and had actually been a part of it. I'd never realized how competitive they were with each other, and the constant use of sneaky and unfair tactics was almost overwhelming. The last time I was in school I was one of the boys, and we just shouted or wrestled each other if there was ever a problem. The girls in school always appeared to be angels, hugging and kissing and smiling at each other, which is exactly what I thought they'd be like in senior school. The girls were nowhere near my angelic expectations, and the thought that I was one of them and could very well be using underhanded tactics like rumor spreading and backstabbing was immensely terrifying. Already I was hearing countless rumors about Vicky that sounded too extreme to be true. One that Courtney told me was that Mrs. Dunn and Vicky are related, and the head teacher bribed an opposing school to forfeit a football match and let Vicky's team win. It was so hard to tell whether the rumors were true or whether they were just made up out of some other girl's jealousy. It was actually a relief when Jenny interrupted our little group conversation, and the girls had to keep silent whilst Jenny went about describing our next task. Jenny split the class into groups of 4, allowing Poppy, Courtney, Ashley and I to stay as a group, whilst making Vicky abandon her lackey and group up with 3 boys. I didn't think there was any degree of favoritism in her decision, not one bit. Our task was to come up with a mime routine which we would show the rest of the class during next week's lesson. We were provided with 4 items to share amongst our group, which we would use to help create a routine. We received a fake beard, a black eye patch, a pink tutu and a horned plastic helmet with fake braids hanging down over the ears. The items were dumped in front of us and my first instinct was to go for the eye patch, but Poppy snatched that away from me instantly. Before I could decide what my second choice was, Ashley and Courtney had already made their choices. All that was left for me was the incredibly girlish pink tutu, which coincidentally matched the color of my backpack. The girls were quick to put on what they'd chosen, with Courtney wearing the fake gray beard and Ashley proudly wearing her horned helmet. She could hardly stop herself from grinning whenever she swung the long ginger-colored braids, but I could hardly stop myself from blushing as I limply held the constantly rustling pink tutu between my fingers. The girls encouraged me to wear it properly, whilst I tried to come up with other uses for it that would avoid actually wearing it in public. None of the girls were impressed by my slingshot idea, and none of them wanted to trade with me, so all I could do was desperately wait until the bell rang and the lesson ended. But Jenny, who was once again doing her rounds and visiting each group, was the one to end my hopes of avoiding embarrassment and kick us into gear. She only had to say a few sentences to get us moving, and started by sneaking up behind me and casually pulling my blazer off. She distracted the girls by asking in a fairly normal tone, "Have you come up with anything yet, girls?" We had just been spending our time chatting and arguing about the tutu, so we hadn't made much progress on our ideas just yet. We all just shook our heads as Jenny placed my blazer on a hook and sighed loudly for all of us to hear. She snatched the rustling pink tutu from my fingers and before I could do anything, she was lowering it down over my head and then tugging it past my small breasts. The rustling of the lace material settling around my hips and the pink nylon waistband tightening around my waist brought the boiling heat to my cheeks once again. Ellie will play the ballerina, Pops is the pirate, Ash is the Viking and Court is the old man, Jenny declared, and without waiting for our reactions she continued on to the next group. The four of us stood silently for a few moments before we actually started to work, and from there we found it much easier to get into a rhythm and get some sort of a sequence together. I don't think Jenny was expecting a masterpiece from any of us, and we knew we weren't really working towards something serious, but as we struggled to create something to join all of our characters together in mime, we did end up having quite a bit of fun. It took me a while to forget about the tutu, but eventually the rustling of the lacy material blended in with the laughter and chatter of everyone in the class. My only source of embarrassment came from my role as the ballerina, which meant I had to dance like one constantly. Ashley, who had also taken a lead role in the group, kept on making me do twirls and little girlish jumps whilst the rest of the group mimed their own characters until we all joined together at the end of the sequence. It wasn't anywhere near professional, but we all had a good laugh throughout, as did everyone else. I could see Jenny had a proud little smirk on her lips as the bell ringing was hardly heard over the laughter of the students at the end of the lesson. I realized now why she was such a popular teacher among the students, because her lessons were always fun. I was still relieved to get out of the tutu and to see my black pleated skirt once again, which was probably the first time I was glad to see it there and tightly encasing my legs. The girls were quick to compliment me on my dancing during the class, causing me to blush again and again. I had never really danced before, but I had always thought of myself as being quite limber and flexible, so the jumping and twirling was pretty easy as well as being something that I never planned to do again. We could do with some good dancers in the drama club, Jenny whispered in my ear as I was putting my blazer back on. She'll be there, Ashley replied for me. Good, I look forward to seeing you all there. Jenny smiled at each of us as she left to say goodbye to some other students. I can answer for myself, you know, I said to Ashley, a little irritated. You would have joined drama club anyway, every girl in our group has, she grinned at me. As the four of us left the classroom, I found myself thinking about how much I actually enjoyed drama. I don't think it was the dancing, but it was the acting and performing with a bunch of friends that was actually quite fun, and probably something I wanted to do again. I wasn't certain of that, but I was certain that I'd found some new friends already and was well on my way to surviving my first day of school. The last time I was in school, it was a struggle to get through every day, and I spent the whole time wishing I was back at the cul-de-sac playing with my only friends. Of course, now things are totally different, with the school feeling a bit more like a second home. I really hoped that Lucy and Lauren were doing as well as I was on the first day. Meet up at break time in the usual spot, Ash shouted behind us as Court turned and went down a different corridor. Our next lesson was music, and Ash was in our class once again. She was glad to be with us for another period, as she was quite eager to be the one to get Poppy and I really settled into our new school. Being part of the drama club is like a requirement for us, not only because we're in Jenny's tutor group but also because it's the only way we can stay close to Vicky, Ash said. But we still enjoy it, and so will you too. I don't see why we have to join as well, Poppy said as we walked through a long courtyard towards the music block. Well, it's the rules that the group follow, Ash said, and if we're not all in this together then we'll never take down Vicky. Performing in school productions, playing the lead roles, it keeps the spotlight on us. I was slowly starting to understand the tactics of this war, but I knew I still had a lot to learn. The one important thing to remember was that if we didn't stay close to Vicky in terms of year group-wide popularity, we wouldn't have a chance against her. At the other end of the courtyard, we reached a set of concrete steps which many of the older students had sat down on. Ash led us away from them and towards a small sheltered corridor that joined the quad with the music block, where some of the students with dark makeup and black hair were hanging around. This is where the emo people hang out, but don't worry. The girls never stay around here too long, Ash said. Poppy and I nodded and were both uncomfortably aware of the stares we were getting from the emo kids, who seemed to get creepier every time you looked at them. Ash led us through a set of doors and up a ramp, where we immediately saw signs for the music block. We had to walk in single file, as many of the older students enjoyed standing on either side of corridor and making everyone walk between them. It was like a man-made valley of death that they had created, with some of them deliberately tripping the smaller kids when they walked by, but thankfully they seemed to ignore us as we passed through. Whether it was because of Ashley's popularity, or because we were just little girls in their eyes, I would never know. But I was glad to get through unharmed while some of the boys my age were being pushed around and blocked at every turn. When we finally reached the music block, it felt like we had been traveling for hours, but really it was only a few feet from the ramp we had just climbed up. Our journey was just made much longer because of the amount of feet and big people that we had to get around. As the door closed behind us, it shut out all sounds of shouting and screaming coming from the corridor. The music block was almost in another world, closed off from the rest of the school, and all we could hear was someone playing the piano and the faint chatter of students as they waited outside classroom doors. There were 2 classrooms in the music block, with 2 other small rooms that were used for playing instruments in private. There was nobody else in sight except for a large group of students that must have been the rest of my class, which thankfully did not include the dreaded Vicky. The class proceeded quite slowly without the gossipy chatter from court, and it was somewhat more boring compared to drama. Our teacher, Ms. Bruce, didn't really seem to care much about the younger students and spent most of the lesson doing what she called planning for the upper year groups. There was no icebreaker activity for us to do, and for the first few minutes of the lesson we were just allowed to sit and talk as we liked. Ash and Pops continued talking about the clique whilst I silently listened, hardly understanding much of what was being said. The incredibly slow pace of the lesson was enough to almost make me fall asleep, only to be woken up almost halfway through the lesson by Ms. Bruce asking, "So do any of you play instruments?" She sounded quite desperate to get a good response, as if nobody played an instrument, she would be stuck with a useless group of students for a whole year. Only a few girls and boys put their hands up, including Ash and Pops, who had never said anything about playing an instrument before. My hand obviously remained down, as I had never really been motivated enough to play an instrument, ever. Ash glanced at me, and then quickly nudged me with her pretty sharp elbow. It felt like a blunt dagger had just poked my side, and I glared back at Ash wondering why she would punish me so, but she grabbed my hand before I could use it to massage the wound, and then held my hand high above my head. Ms. Bruce smiled proudly as her gaze floated across the 3 of us, all with our hands up to say that played an instrument, but she seemed to ignore the slightly pained look on my face as she went on to look for more hands. "When she asks you, say you play the guitar," Ash whispered to me when Ms. Bruce wasn't looking. "But I don't," I whispered back at her. "Trust me, you'll love it. I'll even teach you a bit," she replied with a confident grin. Later in the class, after Ms. Bruce had allowed each of us to play on the keyboards for the rest of the lesson, she came to our table and quite joyfully said, "So you 3 girls all play instruments?" Pops and Ash happily explained that both were learning to play the piano, whilst Ash was also learning to play guitar. When Ms. Bruce turned to me, I had to lie and say I was also trying out the guitar. It was either that or risk my newfound friendship with Ash, who grinned at me when the teacher left and said, "Trust me, Elle, you won't regret this in the future." Even though I had never played the guitar, Ashley's confidence in me was enough to make me feel good about the prospect. I was soon imagining myself as some sort of famous rock star when I got older, or at least a really good guitar player. And then there was drama, which was something I was already pretty good at. The future was looking pretty good at this point. The rest of the day was probably going to be as boring as music was, as I had lessons like history, maths, and art. Only P.E. at the end of the day seemed exciting, with all the running around and sports. I had never really tried any sports, but anything sporty would be so much better than sitting at desk for 50 minutes. So the rest of the day would be boring, and if I didn't come across Vicky again, the only terrifying thing left would be my first time in the girls' changing rooms, that was coming at the end of the day. But before all of that, I had to get through morning break time, a 20-minute break between period 2 and 3, which was where Ash planned to introduce Poppy and I to the rest of the group. When the bell rang, we gathered our things and were straight out the door, all of us eager to find a more fun setting. Ash led us back down the ramp and past the sheltered corridor where the emo kids were hiding, then into the wide-open courtyard which we had passed through earlier on our way to music. There were students all around us playing, talking, eating, and it was a struggle for us to make our way through them. We eventually arrived at a small section of the courtyard which was pretty close to the school perimeter fence, and had 4 large picnic tables arranged with several students sitting down on and around them. It became clear that this little area was the clique's territory, as everyone was saying hello and hugging Ash as we walked into the center with the 4 tables around us. Court was sitting with most of the girls from the group we had met before drama, and we still didn't know the names of each of them. "Girls, let's welcome Ellie and Poppy, they're with us now," Ash said, and almost instantly the girls all around us were coming up to Poppy and I and hugging us gently. There were so many of them around us, so for now I'll just name those girls who were part of the inner circle of the group, which had claimed 1 picnic table to themselves. The rest of the girls and a few boys had seated themselves around that 1 table, either sitting on the floor, or the other tables, or standing. There was Ash, the apparent leader of the group, Court was the second in command, and then there was Carly, Sarah, Megan, Rebecca and Katie. They were really just a group of girlfriends, all as popular as each other, but Ash was the one leading the way, whilst refusing to actually call herself the leader. It also turned out that Rebecca and Katie were both in our tutor group along with Ashley and Courtney, but they were towards the end of the register so I hadn't got much of a look at their faces before now. Sarah was just a very common name, as the Sarah in our tutor group was actually in Vicky's clique, and was ignored as much as possible by the girls, unlike the Sarah in our clique who was almost as gossipy as Courtney. "Carly? Do you still have some spare bracelets?" Ash asked as she sat down with the other girls of the inner circle. Poppy and I remained standing beside the picnic table, both of us feeling like we had to have permission to sit down. Carly was about my height, with long hair a lighter shade of brown compared to Ashley's and bright blue eyes. She was seated right in front of us on the opposite side of the table, and had an excited grin on her face as she pulled open the zips of her bag and shoved her hand inside. Poppy and I were told to sit down at the table, and waited whilst Carly's hand made all the noise. "This is one of our traditions that we started at our last school," Court said, pulling back the sleeve of her blazer to show a small silver chain around her wrist. There were pink and silver hearts attached to the chain, as well as other tiny jewels. Carly withdrew her hand from her bag and then reached across the table towards me, which also pulled her sleeve back to reveal the same bracelet Court had. Carly unfurled her hand, picked up the silver charm bracelet in her palm and attached it around my own left wrist, complete with several of its own pink and silver hearts. The girls at the table all shared a smile directed at me as Carly connected the 2 ends of the bracelet together, whilst I also caught some envious stares from outside of the inner circle. We all wore these bracelets as a promise to each other to remain friends forever, and for as long as we wear these bracelets we will never betray each other, Carly said as she then went about attaching another bracelet to Poppy's wrist, to go with her other chain bracelet. "And whenever we share a moment together, we add a little jewel to our bracelets to remember it," Carly grinned. After Carly spoke of remembering past times, the group erupted into giggles and chatter as they took turns in describing what each jewel on their bracelets was associated with. There were all pretty big events, like being there for when somebody's brother or sister was born, attending a wedding together, going on holiday together and moving next door to each other. Poppy and I felt slightly left out because we didn't have any of these memorable moments to share with the other girls, but I think we both silently agreed to get 1 new jewel for when we both met, and another jewel for when we joined the clique. Ash eventually calmed down the rest of the group, and when everyone at the table was listening, she spoke as quietly as possible whilst the girls at the tables around us were all talking amongst themselves. "So tonight is our annual sleepover at my house, are you two coming?" Ash looked at Poppy and I. Poppy was quick to say yes, but there were much more hesitation from me. The last sleepover I was invited to was with Kirsty and her friend Emma, which had apparently been delayed by a few weeks. But when I first thought about a sleepover with a bunch of girls, I imagined girly TV shows and makeovers, something that I feared more than most things. Now I wasn't sure whether to fear it or embrace it, but I knew I'd never get anywhere by avoiding it. I looked down at the bracelet and its multiple girlish hearts that adorned my wrist, and then I glanced at each of the girls around me that were all expecting an answer. I really couldn't say anything other than yes to them, and hoped that I would eventually get over my fear of girlishness. The rest of the day passed by without incident, and pretty soon I was starting to get back into the usual boring school rhythm, a year or so after leaving it. Being in school once again seemed much more exciting this time around, whether it was because I was a girl, or because I was somewhat popular, or just because I had friends in my classes, I wasn't sure. There was definitely a lot more to think about compared to my last experience of school, where it was just 6 lessons and lunch before I went home again. Now I had to think about this war with Vicky, my newfound group of friends, my constantly exposed legs, the uncomfortable looks I got from some of the boys, and the growing mounds on my chest. And then there's my sudden interest in the guitar and drama. All of it was almost too much to handle. I would never be able to handle all of that if I didn't have Poppy and the girls supporting me, as well as each other, in everything we did. That was the feeling I had when Carly attached that bracelet around my wrist to make me officially part of the group, a group of girls who trusted and loved each other like sisters. I knew I could rely on any of them, even if I hardly knew them. They were my safety net. The funny thing was that I could actually think of them as my family, since I'd only really known my real family for a couple of weeks. These girls could be as much sisters to me as Lauren and Lucy are, if only a few weeks behind them in terms of how long I'd known them. We spent the rest of morning break time talking about what the girls had done over the summer holiday, and I was quick to realize that none of them had many individual stories to tell. All the talk was about movies that they all went to see together, birthday parties that they all attended, day trips that they all went on. You generally got the idea that the girls never split up for very long, always seeing each other and staying in contact. It was like a mini spy network. Each of them almost always knew what each other was doing, either by being there with them or hearing it from them an hour later through instant messaging. Of course, 6 weeks of summer break only lasted so long, and the girls ran out of things to talk about just before the bell rang for the end of break time. My next lessons before the lunch break were history and maths, which continued the trend of female teachers that I'd had for each of my classes so far. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I wondered if my parents' plan to give me a very feminine upbringing included making sure all of my teachers were women. Ms. Brown was going to be my history teacher for the next year, as well as Poppy's and Katie's, and she gave us all hope for having a fun year as she started off the lesson by talking to each of us individually whilst we watched an old documentary about Henry VIII. She was nice when everyone wasn't supposed to be writing something down or listening, but whenever someone spoke when they weren't supposed to, she was quick to shout, "Everyone will work in silence until the end of the lesson." It was an immediate after-school detention if anyone except her spoke after that, so it was safe to say the class remained silent until the bell rang. Maths was so far the frontrunner for the friendliest lesson that I had on my timetable, as only Courtney wasn't in the class. Ashley, Carly, Sarah, Rebecca, Megan, Katie and Poppy were all in the same class as me, and as soon as we realized that, each of us turned hysterical as we thought about how fun we could make maths over the coming year, which was traditionally a boring subject. The 8 of us occupied 2 rows of desks, one in front of the other, at back of the class. We tried to stay as far away from the front of the class as possible, but Mrs. Woods was always able to keep a close eye on us. I had already met Mrs. Woods several weeks ago during the garden party at Kirsty's house, but in her eyes she'd met Lauren, not Ellie. She was probably Suzanne's closest friend, but she seemed to hardly care about her friend lying to her about the number of children she had, and was actually quite jolly when she came over to talk to me. Ms. Dawson?" she asked when she was walking around the class and trying to establish the beginnings of a friendship with each of her students. I nodded at her with a small smile and remained silent, since I wasn't sure how she was going to react to seeing me again. Or seeing Lauren again, depending on what she knew. "I've met your sister Lauren. Is she always such a prankster?" Mrs. Woods grinned at me. I shrugged at her, a little relieved she didn't know the full story, but I still gave her a puzzled look because couldn't think of what she was referring to. "Hasn't she told you?" Mrs. Woods asked, quite surprised. "She pretended to be one of my friend's daughters. It was only a few weeks ago that I found out about her real family." She smiled down at me. "Oh yeah, she's like that sometimes," I said, basically talking about myself. We shared awkward smiles and eventually she said, "Well, I look forward to teaching you and your sisters this year," before she moved on to another row of students that she needed to introduce herself to. "I suppose Suzanne got away with pretending to be my mother, then," I mumbled to myself. Maths passed by quickly with almost the entire group around me, but I quickly realized it would be a struggle to get any work done in class with the girls constantly gossiping. I wouldn't be surprised if Mrs. Woods decided to split us up for our next maths lesson. Then again, the class didn't really have much work to do, which was the trend with all of my lessons in school so far. Mrs. Woods focused on getting everyone introduced, and then by the time she was finished, we only had 10 minutes left, so she gave us a couple of simple maths problems to solve. When the bell rang at the end of maths to signal the start of lunchtime, the class emptied into the corridors within seconds. The corridors were so packed when we blended into the crowd of black uniforms, there was no space to really move any quicker than a slow shuffle. I probably wasn't the only one who feared for their lives when we started going down the staircase from the third floor of the maths block. People were pushing and shoving all around us, but strangely did their best to remain slow and calm whenever they got near our little group of girls. It was like we had some sort of unbreakable aura around us when the group were together, preventing anyone from barging past us on the stairs or shoving us in the corridors. That all changed when we reached the ground floor of the maths block, and all the older students joined the crowd. Pretty soon the older students, who didn't care much for our aura of calmness, were starting to easily push between our little group. I had two older girls, perhaps year 11s, standing in front of me and easily blocking my view with their bums. The 8 of us desperately clung to each other's hands to try and stay together, as there was a genuine fear among every small person in the crowd that we would get trampled. We couldn't see anything apart from black blazers, and for all we knew we were just walking in circles. "Ellie!" I hardly heard someone shout my name. I looked around desperately and could only see Ash and Poppy hanging onto my arm, the rest of the girls hopefully behind them. Both Ash and Poppy had ever-growing looks of desperation on their faces, and I could feel their hands starting to slip away. The combined voices of the crowd had evolved into one loud roar as we gradually got closer to the canteen, but I didn't think any of us were going to be in the mood for food after struggling to survive. "Ellie!" I heard someone shout my name again. This time it was clearly a girl, and much closer. I didn't have much time to look around and find this mystery girl's voice before a curtain of her blonde hair blinded me briefly. I got a load of her perfume up my nose as she suddenly appeared and started pulling me out of the crowd, with such ease and confidence that I knew exactly who it was. "Hey Lucy," I said while struggling to catch my breath after we'd been pulled right out of the crowd and were standing in a nice and thankfully quiet garden area. The rest of the girls had somehow been able to keep a hold of each other, and were grouped up behind me even after Lucy had roughly pulled me away from them. We must have cut through the crowd like some sort of snake with daggers after we had a strong girl like Lucy pulling us. "Didn't you hear me yelling?" Lucy asked irritatingly, with her hands on her hips. Her long dark blonde hair had changed slightly from when I last saw her, and was held in a loose bun behind her head by some sort of claw-like hair accessory. "It's kind of hard to hear through the crowd when I'm not as tall as you," I said in an almost equally irritated voice. Lucy sighed and changed her pose slightly to appear friendlier in front of my friends, who stayed gathered behind me in silence. "I'm sorry," she said. "I just got really nervous when I saw you in the middle of that chaos." "Thanks for saving us," Ashley said from behind me. She had a wry smile on her face when I looked at her. Lucy smirked back and noticeably calmed down, and then introduced herself to the girls as my older sister, but forgot to include the overprotective part. Each of the girls, excluding Poppy, looked at Lucy incredulously as if they didn't believe she was my sister. "Ellie, you never said you had an older sister as pretty as her," Carly whispered into my ear, along with some of the other girls saying mostly the same thing. They all sounded a bit jealous, but all whispered loud enough for Lucy to hear. I could see a small grin forming on my big sister's lips. "Do you girls mind if I borrow my sister for a bit?" Lucy asked, even though it sounded more like she was making a statement rather than asking for me. The girls behind me, along with whispers of "go, go," gave me a couple of nudges forward even though I was actually looking forward to spending lunch with the girls. Lucy placed her arm across my back and then we were immediately on the move to spend the lunch break with the other girls. I hadn't forgotten about the Dawson sisters' plan to regroup at lunch, and it's not that I didn't want to hang out with my sisters, as if we didn't do that enough at home. I just wanted to spend lunch with my friends and not feel like the new girl in school. I knew that once we found Lauren, all we would talk about was how our first day was going. All I wanted was to blend in quickly and just appear like any other kid in school, not stand out because I'm new. On top of being stage girl and an enemy of the most popular girl in our year, being the new kid was definitely too much to handle. "I'm glad you've made a load of friends so quickly, sis," Lucy said as we re-entered the main lobby of the school, her arm still across my back and shepherding me in every direction Lucy decided to go. It was like the supermarket with Suzanne all over again, being protected and guided down corridors and through crowds of older people, but it was much less embarrassing this time around. "You must have more friends than me by now, Lucy," I said enviously. "My friends already think you're the most popular girl in school." She giggled a little at that, and I was glad to hear her say that she's already got a few new girlfriends to hang around with. But for now her overprotectiveness of her sisters was taking priority over any urges to make new friends, unlike me. We eventually entered the central courtyard on the school, which was surrounded by subject departments on every side. There were hundreds of black uniforms sitting around, on brick walls, on the floor, leaning against bins, against walls, everywhere. All of them were enjoying their lunches, and I wouldn't be able to join them in feasting until we found Lauren. Well, it looks like Lo has found a few friends as well. "All three of us are doing pretty good," Lucy said proudly as she glanced across the courtyard. I followed her gaze, looking directly down the outside of the main hall, and then the huge indoor gym further beyond. There were even more black uniforms hanging around there, either playing basketball or football, which made me wonder why Lucy had found Lauren there amongst them. "Those can't be her friends, that's Vicky," I said fearfully, my voice slowly rising to the point where I was almost shouting. "Who?" Lucy asked, totally oblivious to the war that was currently going on in the year groups below hers. I ignored her question and quickly found my own sense of sisterly love driving my feet, as both Lucy and I sprinted across the courtyard to where Lauren was surrounded by a dozen girls. As we got closer to the group, we realized that every person surrounding Lauren was calling her names. I saw Vicky standing in the group with her arms crossed and a grin on her face, and I knew she had something to do with it. Lauren must have walked straight into a trap, where Vicky and her minions surrounded her, most likely because of our little meeting with Vicky in drama. Lucy, without any care in the world for Vicky and her domination of the year group, easily barged past several smaller kids and pulled Lauren away. She did it just as easily as she did before, when I was the one in the middle of chaos. This time Lucy was also able to disperse most of the crowd just by standing there, whilst Lauren and I stood in the safe zone behind her. "Come to kiss my feet like everyone else?" Vicky said with an arrogant grin. Lucy stood in a heroic pose in front of us, her arms crossed. I think she was trying to scare Vicky away, but that wasn't as easy as with her minions. Vicky only appeared slightly fazed, and stood on her spot waiting for a reply. A dozen year 10 girls suddenly walked past us and gathered either side of Lucy, and one of them asked, "Problem here, Lucy?" I edged closer to the confrontation, along with Lauren, both of us remaining silent but sending angry glares across to Vicky, who started to back away as the older girls gathered. "No, she was just leaving," Lucy said with a degree of sarcasm. Vicky nodded solemnly and started walking away, but not before she gave Lauren and I a quick glance as if to say, "You win this round." During lunchtime, the three of us talked about how each of us was doing on our first day, and the one who was doing the worst was Lauren. She had made a couple of friends herself, but each of them turned out to be in Vicky's group, and they burned her when they figured out she was the sister of Stage Girl. And when Lucy and I saw how Vicky treated people like Lauren, who were alone and against her, we both knew that Lauren needed the protection of Ashley and the girls. Lucy and her older girlfriends couldn't be around all the time, so Lauren would have to join the clique just like I did. It was like joining a mafia family, a place where we were guaranteed protection. Ashley was quick to welcome Lauren into the group during art class after lunch, where she said, "If you're Ellie's sister, then you're our sister too," with the rest of the girls nodding along. Art was so far the only lesson that I shared with Lauren, and there were probably more lessons that we shared as the week went on, but we could only hope. The only girls who weren't in our art class were Courtney, Rebecca and Megan, but I was sure they'd welcome her to the clique just as much as everyone else. The art block was on the edge of the school, quite close to the front gate which Mum and Dad had drove us past in the morning. From our second-floor classroom, we could see over the school fence and across the roofs of hundreds of houses. It was torture, having a classroom with a window view of the outside world, and it was even worse being in that classroom towards the end of the day and just waiting for that bell to ring. "You know they shoot anyone who tries to escape," Katie said, catching me staring longingly out the window. "Huh?" I gasped at her. "I'm kidding." She giggled, causing her medium-length blonde hair to sway gently. Katie was yet more proof that our tutor group always gets the pretty people, with her blonde hair blue eyes combination, and she was like a young blonde version of Suzanne with her own everlasting smile. "Ugh, I can't wait to get out of here," Sarah moaned from across the long table that we all occupied. She was just as pretty as the rest of the girls, with her long dark brown hair. She was like our very own Miley Cyrus look-alike. "One more lesson to go," Poppy sighed. Each of us slumped our shoulders and continued with our work, which was basically just doodling. Mr. Thomas, our bald art teacher, wanted to gauge our drawing skills, but just like Ms. Bruce in music, he was constantly busy with the work of the upper year groups. Towards the end of the lesson, I completely blanked on what my last lesson of the day was, so I quietly scrambled around in my bag and pulled out my timetable. It already looked worn and ragged after only a day, and I wondered how it had gotten ink smudges on it, but I decided to ignore it. "Do any of you guys have P.E. next?" I looked around the table hopefully. Each of the girls gave me confused looks, and then shook their heads. "Year 8 don't normally have P.E. on a Tuesday," Ash said. "Well, my timetable says otherwise," I sighed. I was yet to see what a class without any of the girls was going to be like. "Where's your P.E. kit?" Poppy asked. I looked down and around my feet, and only saw my own little humiliating Roxy backpack along with the girls' bags, but nothing with my P.E. kit inside. I felt stupid for not bringing it, seeing as I looked at my timetable before we left for school. But I must have decided to bring my kit if I saw P.E. was on my schedule today, surely? "I don't have it," I grew more depressed. "Don't worry, Elle, they'll give you some stuff to wear," Katie said. When art finished, I really felt alone for the first time that day. The rest of the girls, as well as anyone else that I recognized, all headed off in the opposite direction to me when the bell rang for the beginning of period 6. They were all saying that they had ICT, which was generally a lesson in which all we did was play around on the computers. I felt like the only one in my year group who joined the small crowd gathering outside the P.E department. Everyone there was taller than me, and also looked older than me and many of my friends. Maybe they were from the other side of the year group, but I had gotten the idea that the two sides remain separated in classes and only really come together during break time. Then again, I've only been at All Hallows for a day, so I didn't know exactly how things worked around here. There were 4 teachers, 2 men and 2 women, standing on a stairway in front of the crowd. They ordered us to get into 4 lines, 2 for the girls and 2 for the boys. This time I didn't make the mistake of joining the male lines like I almost did on preparation day, and quickly found myself close to the front of one of the girls' lines. I stood there surrounded by taller girls in front and behind me, as well as on my left, with the hard brick wall of the sports hall on my right. Nobody seemed concerned by the relatively small girl standing among them, not even the teachers who had a commanding view of everyone from their perch on the stairs. When everyone was silent and the lines were as straight as possible, the teachers allowed us to start piling in through the doors and into the changing rooms. Each of the teachers disappeared before I could ask about getting a spare uniform, and I never really got the chance to stop and find one of them because of the pushing and shoving coming from the girls around me. The boys had gone up the stairs, whilst us girls practically charged into our changing room on the ground floor. The air was already feeling hot and stuffy when I got inside, where I was confronted by even more high-tech machinery just like I'd seen on preparation day when Ms. Darcy was dressing me in my new uniform. Immediately in front of us was a set of mechanical gates which only opened after we'd inserted our student ID cards, so I had to pull my bag of my shoulders and search desperately inside it to find my ID. The girls behind me were shouting and jeering as I spent countless minutes trying to find one stupid card. The longer I made them wait, the longer it would take them to get changed, and the longer it took them to get changed, the angrier their teachers were when they were finally ready to start class. When I inserted my card, a green light flashed above me and the mechanical gates opened, with my ID card waiting for me on the other side of the gate. It was just like the turnstiles at a train station, except in a girls' changing room at school. The last time I'd been in a changing room was when I still thought I was a boy and was attending my old school, before taking a year break from education altogether. The changing room in that school was fairly ancient, and looked like it belonged in Victorian times. Since the main building of All Hallows is from Victorian times, I was expecting the same ancient changing room again, but this was totally different. The school must be privately funded, because the government would never invest this much money in a school. The whole room was clean, and small private cubicles filled the whole floor space. Everywhere was white, the tile floor, and the walls of the cubicles, with only the surrounding wall painted a pale pink. Each of the girls were picking a cubicle and sliding their ID cards into slots above the door handle of each cubicle, so I silently followed what they did. It didn't seem to matter which cubicle I picked, as long as I picked one and didn't get changed out in the open. The whole point of the changing cubicles is that you get changed inside them, an older girl said when she noticed me standing outside a cubicle door. "We didn't have these in my old school," I said. "Are you new?" she asked. "It's my first day." "Yeah," I admitted. "They installed these to stop us from chatting and wasting time as we got changed," she said. "Just slide in your ID card and you'll figure out the rest once you're inside." She did exactly as she said and then disappeared behind the door of her own cubicle, so I did the same and was met by another green light. The door opened before me and I stepped into a pretty empty space, with an electronic console hanging down from the center of the roof. On the screen of the console there was a name and a picture of someone, some brunette girl called Charlotte Hudson, who looked about the same age as Lucy and almost as pretty. It must be stuck on the last person that used it, I thought to myself. There were a couple of options below her picture, including P.E kit, chair squat and uniform, so I tapped the P.E kit option on the screen. As soon as my finger touched the screen, a small horizontal section of the back wall slid away, and waiting there in a little space was a clean girl's P.E kit. I couldn't describe the massive sense of relief I felt when I saw that kit, as I'd been worrying about angry teachers shouting at me for forgetting my uniform. I didn't realize this was what Katie meant when she said they'd give me some stuff to wear. However, that sense of relief almost instantly disappeared when I actually walked forward to pick up the kit, and a pair of cold mechanical hands suddenly grabbed my feet. I would have fallen flat on my face if it weren't for another pair of hands that wrapped themselves around my wrists. The metallic material they were made from almost matched the silver of my new bracelet, but they looked incredibly stronger than the flimsy silver chain. A calm feminine voice, albeit slightly robotic sounding, asked gently for me to please stand in the center of the room. I struggled to even move my limbs, with the mechanical hands keeping a firm hold of my ankles and wrists. I couldn't do what the computer was asking, or even get away. The arms seemed to respond to the computer as they easily manipulated me into a standing position, moved me back in front of the console, and then lowered me onto a tile with a pair of illuminated green footprints. My feet were kept tight together and on top of the fake footprints, whilst my arms were held out away from my body like I was about to be crucified. The console that hung from the center of the room suddenly went blank and raised itself up into the roof, and the mechanical arms attached to my wrist were disconnected. They were replaced by what seemed like 100 more arms, including 2 that slowly approached me from either side of the room and clamped themselves around my waist, whilst the 100 other arms went about undressing me. First they removed my backpack, followed by my blazer. They undid every button on my blouse in what felt like a couple of seconds, raised my arms, and then pulled the blouse right off my body, my black tie with it. The hands seemed to stop and pause for thought as they looked at my training bra, as if they were expecting me to be wearing something else. They waited a few moments before deciding to leave the training bra where it was, whilst they threw my bag, blazer, blouse, and tied down what looked like a garbage chute. "No!" I shouted as the top half of my uniform disappeared, but the female robotic voice calmly said struggling will only make this harder, and will increase the likelihood of a punishment waiting for you when you are done. It almost sounded like a death threat. It made me that terrified. I remained silent and still after that, only moving when the computers made me. I was then raised off the ground so that I could be stripped of my shoes, socks, and my skirt, leaving me in just my training bra and white cotton panties. The mechanical hands were now almost freezing when they touched my skin, making me twitch every time they came close. The room was still hot and stuffy because of everyone else getting changed in the cubicles around me, so I was able to stay warm in just my underwear. The hands then held my head in place whilst they tied my long hair in a ponytail at the back of my head, and started to get me dressed in the P.E. kit. My hands were held above my head as a blue polo shirt was lowered over my head, and my feet were raised off the floor so some royal blue school sports shorts could be raised up my bare legs. Long blue socks were then dragged up my legs and were almost long enough to meet the shorts and look like leggings, but they left a little strip of skin exposed just above my knee. Finally, a pair of bright pink football boots, measured to fit my size, was slipped onto my feet. Each and every one of the mechanical hands moved away, and I was finally free to move by myself. One hand remained in front of me and was holding a small tray, and the female robot voice sounded again. "Please put any jewelry in this tray." I removed my silver chain bracelet from my wrist and lowered it into the waiting tray, and waited for a signal to say I was ready to go. "Earrings too," the voice said. "I can't take them out," I replied, somewhat instinctively and without knowing if the machine could understand me. I still had to leave them in for about another month, according to Poppy. There was no voice reply from the robot. Instead, a pair of mechanical hands reappeared and covered my still fairly new piercings in masking tape. With that, I was ready for my first lesson of P.E., and so was every other girl as I exited my private cubicle. It felt like I'd been twisted, manipulated, and dressed like a doll for several hours, when really I'd only been in there for a couple of minutes like all the other girls, each wearing the same kit with their hair tied in ponytails. Only the color of their football boots showed any variety. The actual lesson that took place afterwards was probably one of the most ruthless and humiliating experiences of my life so far. When every girl in the class is taller and stronger than you, it's an extremely terrifying feeling to hear that you'll be playing girls' rugby. All I remember was being thrown about in every conceivable direction, tripped and pushed into every existing puddle, and finishing the class on the bottom of a pile of girls who had jumped on top of me when I'd caught the ball. They knocked me over and I landed face first in a damp patch of mud, after which I was covered head to toe in what looked like poo. I saw Vicky and Natalie laughing with each other as I walked past with the rest of the girls and back into the changing rooms. I tried to hide behind the girls so Vicky wouldn't see me covered in mud. I wouldn't let her have that victory, but I knew she caught a glimpse of me no matter how hard I tried to hide. "Welcome back, Charlotte," the female voice said cheerily as I entered my changing cubicle once again. I groaned back as a response. The mechanical arms went to work stripping my clothes off once again and throwing them down the chute, leaving me once again in my underwear. "Please step into the center of the room," the voice asked, and the footprints on the floor started pulsing with a green light. As soon as I'd put my feet on the spot, four circular drains appeared on the floor around me, and a shower head appeared above me. Without a word from the female robot, the mechanical hands started pulling and tugging at my underwear, whilst working on the clasp of my training bra as well. Even though I was in a private cubicle, I still didn't want to be stripped naked by a machine. I clutched desperately at both my bra and panties, but couldn't hold either in place with just one hand, so I had to pick what needed the most protection. I decided to try and keep my panties on, but lost my bra as soon as I let go of it, and it was tossed down the chute like everything else. The shower started spraying warm water when my bra was gone, almost as if it was trying to distract me enough for the mechanical hands to finally get my underwear off. With one last powerful tug, my panties were ripped out of my grasp, dragged off my wet legs and thrown down the chute before I could regain my balance. I'd only ever been naked in the bathroom at home, and I wanted it to stay that way. Even if I was in a private cubicle, I still felt more self-conscious than ever, and found myself covering the black hole between my legs, as well as the budding boobs on my chest that were really just puffy nipples. The mud eventually washed off my skin and out of my hair, and I was instantly dried by blasts of air all around me whilst the water drained away. "Charlotte, would you like to be dressed according to your tastes of last year? Or would you like to make a new selection?" the machine asked. At first an answer didn't really come to mind, but being constantly called Charlotte was starting to annoy me. "Look, my name isn't Charlotte. Didn't you see that on my ID card?" I asked, feeling proud because I'd outsmarted a computer. "The ID you used belongs to Charlotte Hudson, of Year 10, Tutor Group 10A2. Therefore you are Charlotte Hudson, of Year 10, Tutor Group 10A2. The machine said in the same calm robotic voice, but it only served to set off alarm bells in my head. "There's been a mistake," I shouted. "I'm not in Year 10. The machine ignored my pleas and said, "Very well, you will be dressed according to your tastes last year." The console from before slowly lowered itself to my eye level and started to show several pictures of clothing that it was about to dress me in. It was the usual school uniform, but with a few older girl additions that made my skin crawl at just the thought of wearing them. The back wall of the cubicle slid open once again, revealing a black school uniform neatly folded and cleaned waiting in the small space where the P.E. kit had been before. Whether it was my own uniform, I didn't know, but it looked like Charlotte had left some of her own stuff there for the machine to use. The first piece that the mechanical hands picked up just looked like a length of pink string to me, as it hung from the metallic fingers of the hand. I wondered if it was some sort of necklace or something, but when the hand turned and started moving towards me, more of the material was revealed. There was a triangular-shaped piece of pink cloth and another much smaller triangle piece attached together by two pieces of elastic pink string. Still, I didn't know what it was, and had a random guess that it was some sort of cowboy mask, but oh, was I wrong. The mechanical hands suddenly reached out and grabbed a hold of my wrists and ankles once again as the pink item slowly approached me. I was raised off the ground slightly as the hands lowered the cowboy mask to my feet and then raised them up to my ankles. That was when I suddenly realized what they really were, and I'd been wondering why the machines would put a mask on me before any underwear. But they were actually putting my underwear on without me realizing it until they started raising the pink string contraption up my feet. I tried to wriggle my way free, but obviously I'd forgotten the lesson I'd been taught by the hands earlier, that I couldn't break free. I was lowered back onto the floor and allowed to stand on my own 2 feet, then the hands around my ankles let go and grabbed the string underwear from the other set of hands. Suddenly my ears were filled with the deafening sound of a blow dryer, which seemed to be coming from the cubicles around me as well as my own cubicle. That made me realize, if I can hear what's going in the other cubicles, wouldn't they have heard me screaming before when I was stripped by machines? Only one girl in the changing room knew that I was new, but everyone must have known as well because they weren't saying anything. I stood helplessly as the hands held me in place, with only my legs free to really move, but I dared not move them when the mechanical hands were still raising what looked like an increasingly thinner and sharper piece of string between my legs. Other hands busied themselves with sorting out my hair as a blow dryer was held about my head, whilst others prepared the next pieces of the uniform. There were so many mechanical hands at work, including a pair that picked up a matching lacy pink bra and were slowly hovering back towards me. I could almost forget about the pink underwear, but when I felt that tiny string slip between my buttocks, I knew I'd never forget it. Next, my arms were held out in front of me and were slid into the holes of the bra, which was then dragged up to my shoulders and clasped at the back within seconds. Up until now I'd been wearing a simple flat training bra, but this felt so much mature than I was used to. The way it was made somehow pushed the tiny breasts on my chest up, and the extra padding made them look almost as big as Lucy's. I could barely see my feet when I looked down because my pink-encased boobs were so much bigger. With my uncomfortable underwear on, the hands started dressing me in my own school uniform. The skirt felt like it was cut a little higher than it was before, making me think that it was one of Charlotte's clothes, but the blazer, blouse and tie were all mine. I felt oddly proud looking down at my bigger chest, as if I was as old as Lucy and even older than Lauren, who'd boasted about being a better girl than me many times before. I'd be boasting all the time after this. Now, I've always said that I've been uncomfortable around makeup, and definitely wasn't ready to use it daily like other girls my age, but apparently Charlotte was, and it felt like she used a lot of it. When I was totally dressed I thought the hands would let me go, but instead they were all drawn to my face. 2 arms held clamps around my neck in the form of a neck brace, whilst the hands around my wrists and ankles moved me into a sitting position on top of a stool that had suddenly moved up from the floor behind me. The console lowered itself to my level and used its screen as a mirror to show me what was being done whilst being helpless to stop any of it. My hair was brushed back by 2 hands, and then a U-shaped cushion was placed up and over my head, supposedly to stop my hair from getting in the way but also keeping me comfortable. "Can I go yet?" I asked, wondering what the machines were doing even though I'd finished being dressed. The bell was probably going to ring any second for the end of the day and I wanted to get home, but these machines seemed to be keeping me for no reason. "We aren't finished with your desired uniform yet, Charlotte," the machine said calmly. I could smell the makeup even before I'd seen it, but more hands held my jaw closed as several other hands closed and whilst another held a tray filled with different jars, tubes and cans. Each hand seemed to grab its own brush, pencil or tub and each worked together on my face. They started by spreading a creamy light brown substance all over my face, with small metal fingers holding my eyelids closed when they had to. I could only shout into my teeth and groan my displeasure, such was the restrictions that the mechanical hands put on my face. Then there was a lot of focus on my eyes, as my eyelids were stretched down and black pencil was run along the edges, whilst several thin brushes applied a shadowy brown dust above my eyes with a little below them as well. 2 mascara brushes were held in front of my eyes, which I'd experienced before with Kirsty and had such a hard time not blinking. This time, I still twitched but the mechanical hands seemed to work simultaneously and quickly applied a thick black coating to my eyelashes, which really made my eyes pop when I looked into the mirror provided by the console. Much larger brushes were used to spread a rosy red dust on my cheeks, whilst two separate hands somehow managed to avoid each other as they worked on my lips. One was holding a lip gloss wand and running it across my lips, whilst the other was squeezing and rolling my lips together when the other was done. When work was finished on my lips, all of the mechanical hands backed away as if to admire their work. I had to admit that even though it was a traumatic experience and I was wearing the most uncomfortable underwear I'd worn so far in my life, I looked pretty hot in that electronic mirror. Even if I was just 12, I looked like I belonged in one of the many magazines that the girls in my family read. The smoky eye look made me appear older and more mature, whilst my eyes never looked more defined and my lips were coated in a dark red lip gloss that was on a whole new plane of elegance that I'd only ever seen in classy women's magazines. I'd never be any good as the mechanical hands at doing makeup, but their work on me felt like it gave me a new opinion of makeup altogether. They weren't finished just yet though, as the U-shaped cushion was removed and my hair was allowed to flow freely around my face. Next, the hands were holding hairbrushes and cans of hairspray as four of them started brushing my hair repeatedly. The side parting that I'd done in the morning and the ponytail the machines had done earlier both vanished in a cloud of hairspray and hair product as they brushed, sprayed, combed, massaged and arranged my hair into what Charlotte wanted it to be. I got the feeling that Charlotte was some sort of party girl, as her makeup and the way her hair was full of volume and had this edgy look to it made her look like some of the girls that I've seen Lucy with. We had one night where everyone else was out, so she tried bonding with me by showing her pictures of some parties she went to with friends, who all shared the same ragged and edgy look. All that was missing in the mirror in front of me was tons of other people behind me and flashing disco lights everywhere, and that image on the console could have been exactly like one of Lucy's photos. Most of the hands retracted back into the walls, whilst one pair pulled the strips of masking tape off my ears and then grabbed what would be my footwear. My legs were still naked up to my skirt, so Charlotte didn't wear tights or socks, she wore torture devices on her feet. One of the last pairs of hands edged towards me, whilst another pair slowly raised my feet into the air, which would have revealed my uncomfortable pink underwear to anyone in front of me if I weren't in a private cubicle. Every other hand had disappeared, so I was free to move anything above my ankles, but I figured I'd probably fall on my face if tried to move with my ankles up in the air like they were. Charlotte's shoes were a pair of black pumps with a 3-inch heel, and the machine must have just caught a lucky break when they were easily slid onto my feet without any shoe size worries. My ankles were then lowered, and the last pair of mechanical hands gently held my own hands and pulled me up from the stool that I'd been placed on. And then I was done, and standing in my first ever pair of heels, which was like standing on two large blunt nails. The machine's last action was to drape my Roxy backpack over my shoulders once again and kindly say, "Have a nice day, Charlotte, and may I say you're looking stunning today." Even if I wasn't Charlotte, I had to agree that I was looking pretty good thanks to the traumatic experience of being manhandled by a robot. My ID was handed back to me when I closed the door to my cubicle, and the female voice was right when she said that I used Charlotte Hudson's ID to get in. There was picture of a pretty year 10 girl on the card, and because of our matching makeup she looked like a brunette version, as well as an older version, of me. One name popped into my head when I thought about how my ID card could have been switched. Vicky, or at least her lackey Natalie, who had been caught searching around in my bag by Ashley. I didn't see anything was missing, but then again I didn't think about things being replaced. She must have switched my ID to get me into that older girl's P.D. class so I'd get absolutely crushed by all the other girls, but that still didn't explain why my timetable told me I had P.D. with these girls in the first place. I looked for Vicky as I exited the P.D. department with everyone else, whilst also being glad that I wasn't walking down the stairs in these shoes. I struggled to maintain my balance as my shoes click-clacked against the concrete tarmac, but as I finally got back amongst students of my own year group, I suddenly realized I was breaking about 1,000,000 school rules. The makeup I was wearing had gone way over the year 8 limit of none, and the shoes were so far something that nobody in the whole school was allowed to wear. If there were any rules against stringy underwear or short skirts, I'm sure I was breaking those too. My only hope was to hide amongst a crowd of tall students so I could sneak out of school and out of the teacher's jurisdiction, where I'd hopefully find my friends and sisters and forget about all of this. How I'd explain my appearance to them, I'd have to figure that out along the way. But only 4 backward steps into this plan and it was already falling apart. I backed into someone much taller and sturdier than myself and was instantly turned around by 2 strong arms and found Jenny standing in front of me with a rare angry look in her eyes. "Jenny!" I gasped, half relieved to see a friendly face, half terrified to see a teacher who knew everything about school rules. She crossed her arms and glared at me. "What is going on, Ellie?" she asked. "First I find out you're skipping classes on your first day, and now I find you're wearing more makeup than me and you're dressed like you're about to go clubbing," she shouted. I ignored the confusion in me at the thought of skipping classes, because as far as I knew I'd been to every class on my timetable today, but Jenny seemed to know something I didn't. "There's been a mistake," I stuttered out as a reply. "Oh really, would care to explain why you've made such a mess of your first day then?" she asked, her voice filled with sarcasm. It felt like the care and compassion that she'd given me since I came to the school had suddenly vanished, and I'd discovered a place that only a few people knew about, her bad side. Before I could even think of an answer, Vicky and Natalie barged through the crowd that had been attracted to the shouting, which included a couple of older guys who were looking at me and whispering something along the lines of "She's hot. Who is she? What's going on? You're supposed to be dressed like my ugly sister," Vicky shouted. "What?" Jenny turned her fury to Vicky. "You stole my ID," I shouted back at Vicky. "What?" Jenny's fury turned back to me, even though I just pointed a huge guilty finger at Vicky. Vicky and Natalie then barged Jenny out of the way, without a care for her status and authority as a teacher, and then faced up to me. I couldn't do anything to stop the massive grin from forming on my lips as my eyes wandered onto Vicky's much-idolized breasts, and realized that they'd gone from being bigger than mine in the morning to smaller in the afternoon. She seemed to look at my breasts as I looked at hers, and an instant look of hatred and jealousy shot into her eyes, the total opposite of my proud smirk. She then lunged forward suddenly and shoved me with both her hands, and thanks to my new shoes and my untrained feet, I instantly lost my balance. Everything seemed to slow down as my feet tipped over and I started falling backwards, which caused a rush of fears and thoughts through my head. Chief among them was the sudden realization of how exposed my bum was going to be when I landed, and whether my skirt would actually hide anything with its new length and my new underwear. The thought of hitting my head on the hard concrete tarmac didn't even come to me, even though that was probably the most dangerous of all. The stringy underwear was all that filled my head as I fell. I didn't realize until now how revealing the underwear was, as well as my skirt. With all the cold air breezing about my legs and my exposed bum, I practically felt like I was naked in front of a huge crowd. Thinking that Vicky was standing right in front of me just made it that much worse, if it was even possible to worse. Thank God I was saved. My head was a few feet from the ground when I saw her upside down as she barged through the crowd, grabbed me by my armpits, and then raised me back up to my feet. There was hardly a gasp of shock as Lucy appeared to rescue me, adding to her tally of heroic moments for the day. Nobody seemed to realize how close I was to splitting my head open in the middle of the school, and I don't think I realized until much later. "I thought I told you not to get into trouble," Lucy whispered in my ear as she stood behind me. Telling us to stay out of trouble was the last thing Lucy said to Lo and me at our lunchtime meet-up, but I still hadn't listened. Well, I did listen. I stayed out of trouble, but trouble found me. Several more teachers arrived and then Jenny took control. "Right, the 3 of you are coming to the head's office with me," she said. Everyone stood silent for a moment, until Jenny screamed now. Lucy gave me a gentle nudge from behind and then my momentum took me into the arms of Jenny. She placed her hands on my shoulders and started guiding me away from the crowd, with Vicky and Natalie being escorted by the other teachers ahead of us. I looked back at Lucy and she had the look of a disappointed mother as she shook her head and sighed, with Lo and Ashley appearing either side of her. Want to tell me why you're wearing a G-string too? And how you've suddenly breezed through puberty? Jenny whispered in my ear as my head was turned. My heart almost exploded when she mentioned my stringy underwear, because if she'd seen them then most likely everyone else had seen them too. Oh crap, you saw them? I asked, hoping that she was lying. Relax, Elle, I only caught a tiny glimpse. They could have been anything, Jenny said with a smile. She seemed to calm down after she realized Vicky had done something. It wasn't my fault, I started pleading my case now that Jenny was listening. They switched my ID so the changing machines would think I was somebody else. That doesn't explain why you were in there and not at your scheduled class, Jenny said. But my timetable says I had P.E. last lesson, I said truthfully. Does it? She asked, and then reached for a piece of paper gathered under her arm along with a couple of folders. She held out the paper, which was a copy of my timetable, and then prodded at period 6 on a Tuesday where it said ICT, not P.E. That couldn't be right. My timetable had me going to P.E., but she had a teacher's copy and that couldn't have been wrong, could it? Did you really think we'd be that cruel and put you in a rugby class with a bunch of older girls on your first day here? Jenny smirked. Nobody seemed to care that I was in the lines for P.E., or when I was being mashed to bits as we played rugby, so I never felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. I just felt like I was crap at rugby. I swung my bag off my shoulders and started unzipping it so I could show Jenny exactly what I'd seen on my timetable, but she placed her hand over mine and stopped me. Don't worry, Ellie, I trust you. I've seen what Vicky and her friends did last year, and this is almost exactly the same. You can be sure that Vicky changed your timetable so you saw what she wanted you to see. Jenny sighed, like she'd said that so many times before and was getting tired of it. I nodded slowly and breathed easy knowing that Jenny was back on my side, and had a feeling of eagerness as we approached the head's office. I wanted to see Vicky and Natalie punished, but the head was a fearsome beast and there was much more fear than eagerness in me as we reached the door to her office. I'm sorry for yelling at you, Jenny whispered. It's okay, I said, more concerned with seeing Mrs. Dunn again. And promise me you won't wear your skirt this high again. She lightly tugged at the hem of my skirt, which was halfway up my thighs like a mini skirt and higher up than most of the girls I'd seen in year 11. I promise, were my last words before Mrs. Dunn's aide opened the door and ushered us inside.